confidentiality, and that's what Dr. Ford requested. The ranking member referred Dr. Ford to Democratic activist attorneys closely tied to the Clintons. The ranking member shamefully sat on these allegations for nearly 7 weeks, only to reveal them at the 11th hour when it appeared Judge Kavanaugh was headed towards confirmation because he was so qualified. The ranking member had numerous opportunities to raise these allegations with Judge Kavanaugh personally. I'll give you 6 examples. She could have discussed them with Judge Kavanaugh during their private meeting on August the 20th, a meeting which took place after her staff had sent Dr. Ford to Democratic lawyers, or another time shared them with 64 of her Senate colleagues who also met with him individually. The ranking member's staff could have raised them with Judge Kavanaugh during a background investigation follow-up call in late August. Senators could have asked Judge Kavanaugh about the allegations during his 32 hours of testimony over the course of 3 days. Judiciary members could have asked Judge Kavanaugh about this in their closed session of the hearing, which the ranking member didn't attend. The closed session is the appropriate place to bring up issues where confidentiality is supposed to be respected. And there were no questions about these allegations among the 1,300 written questions sent to Judge Kavanaugh after the hearing. This amounts to more written questions submitted to this nominee after a hearing than to all Supreme Court nominees combined. Keeping the July 30th letter secret deprived senators of having all the facts that they needed to have about this nomination. So it wasn't then until September 13th, July 30th to September 13th, nearly 7 weeks after the ranking member received these allegations and on the eve of the confirmation vote, that the ranking member referred them to the FBI. And somehow they were leaked to the press. It wasn't until those news reports on September 16th that I learned even of Dr. Ford's identity. This is an outrage. The political motives behind the Democrats' actions should be obvious to everyone. Dr. Ford requested the opportunity to tell her story to the Senate Judiciary Committee. After a lot of foot-dragging by Dr. Ford's attorneys, they finally agreed to a public hearing. As promised, I provided a safe, comfortable, and dignified forum for Dr. Ford, as well as Judge Kavanaugh. Dr. Ford was sincere in her testimonies, as was Judge Kavanaugh, who emphatically denied the allegations. It's true that confirmation hearings aren't a trial, but trials have rules based on common sense notions of fairness and due process, not the other way around. It's a fundamental aspect of fairness, a fundamental aspect of due process, that the accuser have the burden of proving allegations. Judge Kavanaugh was publicly accused of a crime, and his reputation and livelihood were at stake, so it was only fair that his accuser have the burden of proof. The consensus is that the burden was not met. Ultimately, the existing evidence, including the statements of 3 alleged eyewitnesses named by Dr. Ford, refuted Dr. Ford's version of the facts. Our investigative nomination counsel, Rachel Mitchell, who has nearly 25 years of experience advocating for sexual assault victims and investigating sex crimes, concluded that there was lack of specificity and simply too many inconsistencies in Dr. Ford's allegation to establish that Judge Kavanaugh committed sexual assault, even under the lowest standard of proof. She concluded, quote, "A he said, she said case is incredibly difficult to prove, but this case is even weaker than that. Dr. Ford identified other witnesses to the events, and those witnesses either refuted her allegations or failed to corroborate them. For the reasons discussed below, I do not think that a reasonable prosecutor could bring this case based upon the evidence before the committee, nor do I believe that this evidence is sufficient to satisfy the preponderance of evidence standard, end of quote. So, we have thoroughly investigated Judge Kavanaugh's background. In addition to the prior 6 FBI full field background investigations with the interviews of nearly 150 people who have known Judge Kavanaugh his entire life, the committee also separately and thoroughly investigated every credible allegation that we received. Our more than 20 committee staff members have worked night and day over the last many weeks, tracking down virtually all leads, and at the request of undecided members, the FBI reopened Judge Kavanaugh's background investigation for another week. The FBI interviewed 10 more people related to the latest credible sexual assault allegations, and the FBI confirmed what we Senate investigators already concluded. That is this: there's nothing in the supplemental FBI background investigation report that we didn't already know. These uncorroborated accusations have been unequivocally and repeatedly rejected by Judge Kavanaugh, and neither the Judiciary Committee nor the FBI could locate any third parties who can attest to any of the allegations. There also is no contemporaneous evidence. This investigation found no hint of misconduct, and the same is true of 6 prior FBI investigations conducted during Judge Kavanaugh's 25 years of public service. Nothing an investigator, including career FBI special agents, does ever be good enough to satisfy Democrat leaderships in Washington who staked out opposition to Judge Kavanaugh before he was even nominated. There is simply no reason then to deny Judge Kavanaugh a seat on the Supreme Court on the basis of the evidence presented to us. The Democratic strategy used against Judge Kavanaugh has made one thing clear: they will never be satisfied, no matter how fair and thorough the process is. 31 years ago, the Senate Democrats' treatment of Robert Bork, their playbook remains the same. For the left wing, advice and consent has become search and destroy, a demolition derby. I'm pleased to support Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation. I'm sorry for what the whole family went through the last several weeks. We should all admire Kavanaugh's willingness to serve his country despite the way he's been treated. It would be a travesty then if the Senate did not confirm the most qualified nomination in our nation's history. The multitude of allegations against him have proven to be false. They've also proven that no discussion of his qualifications came up with any discussion of his qualifications. Nothing showed he wasn't qualified. We had a campaign of distraction from his outstanding qualifications, a campaign of destruction of this fine individual. What we have learned is the resistance that has existed since the day after the November 2016 election is centered right here on Capitol Hill. They have encouraged mob rule. When you hear things about get in their face, bother people at every restaurant where you can find a cabinet member, these are coming from public service that ought to set an example of civility in American society. And it's been made worse by what has happened to Judge Kavanaugh. I hope we can say no to mob rule by voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, I understand that in the order I have 15 minutes. Is that correct?
The senators recognize.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, Madam President, this has been my 9th Supreme Court nomination hearing, And I must say, I've never experienced anything like this. Never before have we had a Supreme Court nominee where over 90% of his record has been hidden from the public and the Senate. Never before have we had a nominee display such flagrant partisanship and open hostility at a hearing. And never before have we had a nominee facing allegations of sexual assault. The nominee before us, being considered for a pivotal swing seat, if confirmed, would be the deciding vote on some of the most important and divisive issues of our day. I'd like to start by speaking about some of the issues in relationship to Judge Kavanaugh. President Trump promised to only nominate individuals to the Supreme Court who would be pro-life and pro-gun nominees, who would automatically overturn Roe v. Wade. In my judgment, Judge Kavanaugh clearly meets the test. In a speech in 2017, Judge Kavanaugh focused on praising Justice Rehnquist and his dissent in Roe v. Wade, where he challenged the right to women's privacy as protected in the Constitution. Also last year, Judge Kavanaugh argued in a dissent in a Texas case that a Jane Doe should not be able to exercise her right to choose because she did not have family and friends help her make the decision. If adopted, this argument could rewrite Supreme Court precedent and require courts to determine whether a young woman had a sufficient support network when making her decision, even in cases, as is in this one, where she had gone before a court. His reasoning demonstrates that Judge Kavanaugh not only is willing to disregard precedent, but his opinions fail to appreciate the challenging realities women face when making these most difficult decisions. When I asked him about whether Roe and Casey were settled law and whether they were correctly decided, he refused to answer. He would only say these cases are entitled to respect. Roe v. Wade, as we all know, is one of a series of cases that upheld an individual's right to decide who to marry, where to send your children to school, what kind of medical care you can receive at the end of life, as well as whether and when to have a family. The government cannot interfere with these decisions according to these cases. Another issue that gives me great pause is Judge Kavanaugh's extreme view on guns. In reviewing his record and judicial opinions, it's clear his views go well beyond simply being pro-gun. During a lecture at Notre Dame Law School, Judge Kavanaugh himself said he'd be, quote, the first to acknowledge that most lower court judges have disagreed with his views on the Second Amendment. Specifically, in District of Columbia v. Heller, Judge Kavanaugh wrote in a dissenting opinion that unless guns were regulated, either at the time of the Constitution was written or traditionally throughout history, they cannot be regulated now, end quote. In his own words, gun laws are unconstitutional unless they are, quote, traditional or common in the United States, end quote. Judge Kavanaugh would have struck down D.C.'s assault weapons ban because they have not historically been banned. This logic means that as weapons become more advanced and more dangerous, they cannot be regulated at all. When I asked Judge Kavanaugh about his views that if a gun is in common use, it cannot be regulated, he replied this way, and I quote, "There are millions and millions and millions of semi-automatic rifles that are possessed, so that seemed to fit common use and not being a dangerous and unusual weapon," end quote. Think about that. Judge Kavanaugh made up a new standard that had nothing to do with common use, but instead relied on whether a gun is widely possessed and owned as determinative as to whether it is subject to any regulation. The United States makes up 4% of the worldwide population, but we own 42% of the world's guns. By Judge Kavanaugh's standard, no state or locality will be able to place any limitation on guns because of widespread ownership in this country. I'm also concerned about his views on presidential power. Specifically, he has said that sitting presidents cannot be indicted, cannot be prosecuted, should not be investigated, and should have the authority to fire a special counsel at will. In other words, the President of the United States is above and outside the law. These views raise serious concerns that should concern us all, especially at a time when the President continually threatens to fire the leadership of the Department of Justice for failing to be loyal and reining in the Mueller investigation. These views alone are not sufficient for me to vote against Judge Kavanaugh. But what we have seen and experienced in the past several weeks has raised serious new concerns, concerns I believe should worry us all. Judges are expected to be, quote, even-handed, unbiased, impartial, and courteous, end quote. However, at the hearing last week, we saw a man filled with anger and aggression. Judge Kavanaugh raised his voice, he interrupted senators, he accused of Democrats of, quote, lying in wait, end quote, and replacing, quote, advice and consent with search and destroy, end quote. He even went so far as to say that Dr. Ford's allegations were nothing more than, quote, a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, end quote. Quote, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, end quote. How could he? This behavior revealed a hostility and belligerence that is unbecoming of someone seeking to be elevated to the United States Supreme Court. His display was so shocking that more than 2,400 law professors from around the country have expressed their opposition. They wrote, and I quote, instead of trying to sort out with reason and care the allegations that were raised, Judge Kavanaugh responded in an intemperate, inflammatory, and partial manner, as he interrupted and at times was discourteous to senators, end quote. The professors concluded, and I quote, we have differing views about other qualifications of Judge Kavanaugh, but we are united as professors of law and scholars of judicial institutions in believing he did not display the impartiality and judicial temperament requisite to sit on the highest court of our land. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to enter a full copy of the letter in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Finally, I want to mention the serious and credible allegations raised by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez, the two women who came forward to tell their experiences facing sexual assault. When Dr. Ford decided to make her story public, she faced all her worst fears. She was harassed, she received death threats, she had to relocate her home, her husband, and 2 children, and yet, in less than a week, she came before the Senate and told 21 senators she had never met, along with millions of Americans, about the most tragic, traumatic, and difficult experience of her life. And she did so with poise, grace, and most importantly, bravery. Unfortunately, she was met with partisanship and hostility. My Republican colleagues have largely chosen to ignore her powerful testimony. Senators weren't allowed to hear from any witnesses who could corroborate or refute her account. They refused to gather evidence or do an impartial investigation into her allegations. Deborah Ramirez also reluctantly came forward to tell her story. Like Dr. Ford, Ms. Ramirez offered to speak to the FBI. Both Ford and Ramirez submitted evidence to support their allegations, including naming over 24 witnesses each. Unfortunately, the limited investigation that was conducted by the FBI failed to interview any one of the witnesses these two women identified who could support her account. Let me say that again. They refused to investigate, to talk with any of the 24 witnesses that could have supported their accounts. Mr. President, I think it's important to remember why we're here today. We're here to determine whether Judge Kavanaugh has demonstrated the impartiality, the temperament, the even-handedness that's needed to serve on this great high court of our land. If confirmed, he will join 8 other individuals who are charged with deciding how the laws of our land are interpreted and applied. He would be a deciding vote on the most important issues affecting our country and every American for generations to come. Mr. President, Madam President, based on all the factors we have before us, I do not believe Judge Kavanaugh has earned this seat. Thank you.
Madam President.
Democrat leader.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Madam President, from start to finish, President Trump's nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court will go down as one of the saddest, most sordid chapters in the long history of the federal judiciary. The well was poisoned from the outset when President Trump selected Judge Kavanaugh from a list of names pre-approved by hard-right special interest groups for whom the national interest is a trifling concern compared to repealing Roe v. Wade, cutting people's health care, and achieving a partisan majority on the Supreme Court. The rot worsened when the Republican majority on the Judiciary Committee shielded the bulk of Judge Kavanaugh's records from the public, discarding decades of bipartisan precedent and thwarting norms of transparency and of fairness. And finally, the dam broke under the weight of credible allegations that Judge Kavanaugh committed a sexual assault in high school. In 2018, the Republican majority conducted a hearing that made the Anita Hill hearings in 1991 look fair by comparison. In this hearing, there were no corroborating witnesses on either side, no independent investigation of the facts to inform the questioning. They even hired an outside counsel to put a witness, Dr. Ford, on trial. Only at the 11th hour, urging of breakaway members of their caucus, Republicans submitted reluctantly to a one-week investigation of the allegations, an investigation which was then severely circumscribed by the White House. Our Republican friends blame us for this process. They're always finding a straw man, but nothing could be further from the truth. First, they blame us for delay, knowing full well that Majority Leader McConnell has complete control of when nominees are brought to the floor. Leader McConnell could have moved this nominee 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago. Democrats had no say, and don't, when it comes to who comes to the floor. But in each case, Leader McConnell couldn't move the nominee forward because he was blocked by fellow Republicans, not Democrats, from moving forward. When it comes to complaining about delay, 2 words never come from our Republican friends' lips: Merrick Garland. Republicans are also saying we engaged in, quote, a smear campaign or the politics of personal destruction with this nomination. In reality, again, they're using Democrats as a straw man, because what they're really talking about is what Dr. Ford said. Democrats did not induce her to come forward. Her conscience did. And our Republican friends, are our Republican friends accusing Dr. Ford and her deeply held memories of what happened to her of a smear campaign? Are they accusing Dr. Ford of a smear campaign? Of engaging in the politics of personal destruction? Because that is who they're actually blaming. They're decrying her testimony and then trying to blame Democrats. I don't blame them. They have a flawed nominee. They don't want the focus on the nominee. When future Americans look back at these proceedings, let them draw no lessons from the Senate's conduct here. Let them look back on this chapter as the shameful culmination of the scorched earth politics practiced by the hard right in America. People who will stop at nothing to entrench an advantage on our nation's courts. Let the confirmation process for Judge Kavanaugh be recorded as a sorry epilogue to the brazen theft of Justice Scalia's seat, the ignominious end of bipartisan cooperation and consultation on the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. And for what? For whom were Senate Republican leaders willing to discard all semblance of fairness to confirm? Judge Brett Kavanaugh, certainly a product of an elite education, but also someone with hard-right, conservative jurisprudence, far, far away from what average Americans believe. Why most Democrats opposed his nomination at the outset feels like ancient history now. But let us not forget that, most importantly, we strongly disagree with a number of Judge Kavanaugh's views. He's deeply skeptical of unenumerated rights, including a woman's right to make fundamentally private decisions about her medical care. He's deeply skeptical of the government's role in protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. He's deeply skeptical of nearly all rules and regulations that protect consumers, workers, the environment. And the flashing red light warning sign at the center of Judge Kavanaugh's jurisprudence are his views on executive power and accountability. Somehow, this conservative judge and scholar of the Constitution sees at the heart of American democracy a president cum king, an executive who's unaccountable to the laws he's sworn to uphold, a head of state who, while in office, should be beyond the reach of subpoenas, criminal investigations, or civil investigations. This moment in American history demands deep skepticism about Judge Kavanaugh's views on executive power, nominated as he was by an executive who disdains the constraints of his office and who is at this very moment the apparent subject of investigations his Supreme Court nominee believes should be invalid. I met with Judge Kavanaugh for almost 2 hours, and I asked him about all of those issues. His answers were constantly evasive and utterly unsatisfactory. It was deja vu all over again in the first round of hearings, when Judge Kavanaugh deliberately avoided talking about his views on Roe, health care, presidential accountability, and more. There was no legal reason, rule, or logic that prevented him from being clear and saying what he thought. He was evasive because he knows that his views are deeply at odds with the progress America has made over the last century of jurisprudence, and at odds with what most Americans believe. His performance was not only unfair and frustrating to the Senate, it was unfair to the American people. When a nominee refuses to disclose their views, chances are you have a nominee whose views are far outside the mainstream of America, whether they be far right or far left. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not have as grave a concern about these views as we do, but let no American be surprised if Judge Kavanaugh becomes a decisive vote to restrict the rights and privileges of the American people while stretching the bounds of privilege for the current occupant of the White House. Judge Kavanaugh's nomination ultimately does not only encompass questions of ideology or credentials, but questions of character. Here again, Judge Kavanaugh falls woefully short of what Americans expect and deserve in a Supreme Court justice. He has repeatedly misled the Senate about his involvement in some of the most serious controversies of the Bush administration, including warrantless wiretapping of American citizens, our policy against torture, the theft of electronic records from Democratic senators, and his involvement in the nomination of very controversial judges. Faced with credible allegations of various types of misconduct, Judge Kavanaugh's credibility was again tested, and he continued to dissemble and even prevaricate about easily refuted facts. Beyond the issue of credibility, Judge Kavanaugh presented to the Senate the bitterest partisan testimony I have ever heard coming from a candidate seeking the Senate's approval. whether they be for the bench or the executive branch. Now, there are many who think that what happened when Judge Kavanaugh was 17 years old should not be dispositive. Even if you believe that, his actions at age 53, in terms of demeanor, partisanship, and above all, credibility, should be dispositive. Judges at every level of the federal bench should be held to the highest standard of ethics and moral character. Judges at every level should be judicious and credible and independent, but especially on the Supreme Court. I do not see how it's possible for my colleagues to say with perfect confidence that Judge Kavanaugh has the temperament, independence, and credibility to serve on the United States Supreme Court. So, I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, why Judge Kavanaugh? There is no dictate that you have to march blindly forward with a nominee when there are others available to you. There are many judges who I'm sure conservatives would be happy to have on the court. I'd remind my colleagues, the seat that Brett Kavanaugh aspires to fill was held by a justice who assumed the bench after one nominee was voted down by the Senate and a second nominee withdrew his nomination. But the Republican majority has pressed forward blindly on Judge Kavanaugh, even when brave women came forward to speak truth to power. Why? For what cause? For the sake of winning? That's not reason enough. My colleagues on the other side, if you have doubts about Judge Kavanaugh's credibility, about his ability to tell the truth, about his ability to be impartial and nonpartisan, no matter what you think of his jurisprudence or what he may or may not have done in high school and college, you should not vote to confirm him to the Supreme Court. So, my friends, Democrat and Republican, for all the controversy, all the heavy-handedness of the process, all the hyperbole and vilification of both sides, there's always hope that the Senate can save itself. We can salvage some decency here at the end. If Judge Kavanaugh is rejected, President Trump will select another nominee, likely right of center, probably not to my liking, but without the cloud that hangs over this nominee. And we can proceed to consider that nominee in a much less bitter, much better, less partisan way. A bipartisan majority of senators, considering fully the weight of Judge Kavanaugh's testimony, record, credibility, trustworthiness, and temperament, considering fully the heartbreaking testimony of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, can vote to reject Judge Kavanaugh's nomination and ask the President to send the Senate another name. For the sake of the Senate, of the Supreme Court, and of America, I hope, I pray, my colleagues will do so.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
It was 88 days ago that President Trump announced his nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to fill the current vacancy on the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh is a nominee of the very highest caliber, a brilliant legal mind, an accomplished jurist with a proven devotion to the rule of law. Today, the Senate has the opportunity to advance his nomination. Every one of us will go on record with one of the most consequential votes you ever cast in the Senate. Now, the stakes are always high for a Supreme Court nomination, but colleagues, the extraordinary events of recent weeks have raised them even higher this time. When we vote later this morning, we will not only be deciding whether to elevate a stunningly well-qualified judge to our highest court. Not anymore, not after all this. The United States Senate will also be making a statement. We'll either state that partisan politics can override the presumption of innocence, or we'll reaffirm that in the United States of America, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. We'll either state that facts and evidence can simply be brushed aside when politically inconvenient, and signal that media bullying and mob intimidation are valid tactics for shaping the Senate. The mob can attack, and the Senate caves. Or we'll stand up and say that serious, thoughtful, fact-based deliberation will still define this body. We'll either give notice that totally uncorroborated allegations are now officially enough to destroy an American's life, or we'll declare that our society cannot, must not, will not set the bar so low. So, Madam President, today is a pivotal day in the nomination process of this excellent judge. But it's a pivotal day for us here in the Senate as well. The ideals of justice that have served our nation so well for so long are on full display. So let's step back and sample a few of the choice moments that the Senate and the American people have been treated to during the disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful spectacle of the last 2 weeks. The very night Judge Kavanaugh was announced as the president's choice, we heard the junior senator from Oregon declare that this nominee would pave the way to tyranny. His audience? Crowds of far-left protesters still filling in the blanks on their picket signs. They weren't quite sure who the nominee was going to be yet. We've heard the junior senator from New Jersey describe Judge Kavanaugh's nomination as a great moral struggle in which there are just two camps. You're either complicit in the evil or you're fighting against it. More recently, we've heard the junior senator from Hawaii argue that her personal disagreement with Judge Kavanaugh's judicial philosophy meant, now listen to this, he deserved less of a presumption of innocence when it came to allegations of misconduct. If you disagree with her, you're not entitled to the presumption of innocence when it comes to allegations of misconduct. That's from a member of the Judiciary Committee? That's the definition of due process? Apparently you get due process only if you agree with her. And even more recently, we saw the junior senator from Rhode Island hold forth with great confidence, offering his expert interpretations of goofy jokes in high school yearbooks from the early 1980s. That was incredibly enlightening. Innocent jokes? Beer drinking references? Oh, no. Our colleague was quite positive there must be some other hidden or sinister meanings at play. Until, of course, a number of Judge Kavanaugh's classmates set him straight earlier this week. So stop and consider these snapshots. The absurdity, the indignity. This is our approach to confirming a Supreme Court justice. This is the Senate's contribution to public discourse. Before the ink had dried on Justice Kennedy's retirement, our Democratic colleagues made it perfectly clear what this process would be about: delay, obstruct, and resist. And before the ink had dried on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, colleagues across the aisle, including Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee, were racing to announce they had made up their minds and were totally opposed to his confirmation. Mere hours after Judge Kavanaugh was nominated, my friend, the Democratic leader, promised, quote, "I will oppose him with everything I've got," he said, hours after he was nominated. It was thus abundantly clear that his number one political goal was to defeat the nomination by any means necessary. It was right there from the beginning, Madam President. A clear declaration, plain as day, nothing could get most Democrats to consider this nominee with an open mind. It would be delaying tactics, obstruction, and so-called resistance until the final vote was called. For a few weeks, their efforts played out along lines that sadly have become somewhat ordinary around here. There were excuses for delay. Those fell flat. There were gross distortions of Judge Kavanaugh's record that were batted down by outside fact checkers. And there were all the usual phony apocalyptic pronouncements that are shouted whenever a Republican president dares to nominate a Supreme Court justice. Happened every time. Hostile to women, hostile to vulnerable people, hostile to workers. Same old tricks, same old playbook. But here was the problem. The old plays weren't working. The distortions were being literally drowned out by the facts. Senators received and reviewed more pages of background materials on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination than for every previous Supreme Court nomination combined. We read Judge Kavanaugh's 12-year record of judicial rulings from our nation's second highest court, 300+ opinions. We heard sworn testimony, written accounts from hundreds of character witnesses from all stages of Judge Kavanaugh's life and career. And the picture painted by these facts was nothing like the caricature. Nothing like the caricature. So it was clear, Madam President, the old tactics weren't working. Wasn't going to get the job done. The resistance demanded more. Try something new, they said. Well, we all know what happened next. Uncorroborated allegations of the most sensitive, most serious sort were quickly sharpened into political weapons. One such allegation, shared by Dr. Ford in confidence with the Democratic side of the Judiciary Committee, somehow, mysteriously, found its way into the press. Well, Chairman Grassley immediately set out on a sober, focused search for the truth. The committee collected testimony, organized a new hearing, and most recently asked for the supplemental FBI background investigation, Judge Kavanaugh's seventh FBI investigation. By any fair standard, the facts, the actual facts, proved to be straightforward. No corroborating evidence, none, was produced to support any of the allegations leveled against Judge Kavanaugh. No corroborating evidence from the FBI inquiry or from anywhere else. Nothing. Well, that wasn't enough for our Democratic colleagues, of course. The facts were not exactly the point. After all, we sort of get it by now. When the very FBI investigation for which they'd been clamoring turned up no new evidence, the Democrats moved the goalposts yet again. I believe the latest story is that the whole investigation is invalid. Now listen to this, because individuals who had only recently been told secondhand or thirdhand about nearly 40-year-old allegations weren't treated as essential witnesses. Let me say that again. The latest story is that the whole investigation is invalid because individuals who had only recently been told secondhand or thirdhand about nearly 40-year-old allegations weren't treated as essential witnesses. Never mind that they didn't actually witness anything. They didn't witness anything. So let's be clear, Madam President, these are not witnesses. These are people supposedly in possession of hearsay that they first heard 35 years after the supposed fact. What nonsense. The people whom Dr. Ford claimed were witnesses, they have spoken with the FBI. We know that because they, through their attorneys, put out public statements saying so. And what we know now is what we knew at this time a week ago. There is absolutely no corroborating evidence for these allegations. Same thing we heard a week ago. If they were, you bet we'd have heard about it, but there isn't. So notwithstanding that, Madam President, the leak of Dr. Ford's letter in violation of her privacy and against her wishes opened the floodgates. The feeding frenzy was full on. The weaponization of her letter by the left led to a torrent of other equally uncorroborated allegations. They were dumped on Judge Kavanaugh and his family. And breathlessly, the media seized on them. The more outlandish, the better. Americans were informed that Judge Kavanaugh masterminded violent drug gangs as a young teenager until that accuser walked her story back. We were informed that Judge Kavanaugh beat someone up on a boat in a Rhode Island harbor until that accuser totally recanted. We heard another tall tale of physical assault until that account was thoroughly debunked by a sitting federal judge. Oh, and yes, we were informed that juvenile jokes in his high school yearbook were actually sinister, secret references. All the Keystone cops were on the case. Keystone cops were on the case, Madam President. And Senate Democrats cheered them on. They read parts of this uncorroborated, unbelievable mudslide into the Senate record. They cited them in an official letter demanding that Judge Kavanaugh's nomination be withdrawn. Were they true? Well, of course, that was quite beside the point. Quite beside the point. So long as they were convenient. Every effort was made to ensure that the fact-free verdict of the mob and the media would win out over the actual evidence. Make sure the mob prevails. But the uncorroborated mud and the partisan noise and the physical intimidation of members here in the Senate will not have the final say around here. The Senate will have the final say. So, Madam President, we're almost at the end of the runway. The crosswinds of anger and fear and partisanship have blown strong these past weeks. They've harmed a good man and his family. They've tarnished the dignity of this institution. But all of it can end today. The time has come to vote. The Senate stands on the threshold of a golden opportunity. We have the opportunity to advance the nomination of an incredibly well-qualified and well-respected jurist to a post that demands such excellence. We have the opportunity to put Judge Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, where his distinguished service will make us and our nation proud for years to come. But we have the opportunity to do even more. Today, we can send a message to the American people that some core principles remain unfettered by the partisan passions of this moment. Facts matter. Fairness matters. The presumption of innocence is sacrosanct. The Senate has turned its back on these things before, Madam President, but never for long. and never without deep regret. This institution does not look back proudly on the era of Joseph McCarthy, nor on any of the other times when the politics of personal destruction poisoned its judgment. No, the Senate looks back on those things with shame and with the conviction that we cannot go down that road again. We know the Senate is better than this. We know the nation deserves better than this. By confirming Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, this brilliant jurist will be charged with upholding the rule of law and honoring American justice. We must hold ourselves to that very same standard. We must seize the golden opportunity before us today to confirm a Supreme Court justice who will make us proud, and to reaffirm our own commitment to the justice that every single American deserves.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Is there an objection? Without an objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. No. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. No. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. No. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mrs. Ernst. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. No. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Aye. Ms. Harris. No. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. No. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Isaacson. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. No. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. No. Mr. Kyle. Aye. Mr. Lankford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. No. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Kennedy, Kyle, Lankford, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Manchin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Heinrich, Kane, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Schatz, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Jones, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Donnelly, no. Ms. Heitkamp, no. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Carper?
Senator is not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Carper? No.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to change their vote? As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. On this vote, the yeas are 51, the noes are 49. The motion is agreed to.